Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. This is a quote. What does it mean that a black, lesbian, feminist, warrior, poet, mother is named the state poet of New York? It means that we live in a world full of the most intense contradictions, and we must find ways to use the best we have, ourselves, our work, to bridge those contradictions, to learn the lessons that those contradictions teach. That was from Audre Lorde, who was Poet Laureate of New York from 1991 to 1992. Audre Lorde died in 1992 at the age of 58. Audre Lorde is perhaps one of the most quoted authors and poets today, especially within activist circles. So today we are going to be in conversation about the life and times of Audre Lorde, what influenced Audre Lorde, and the influence that Audre Lorde has had over the years. My guest for this is Alexis Pauline Gumbs. Alexis Pauline Gumbs is an award-winning author of many books, including a biography on Audre Lorde. It's called Survival is a Promise, The Internal Life of Audre Lorde. Alexis Pauline Gumbs, it is my very good pleasure to welcome you to this radio program.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
I've always wanted to do a show on Audre Lorde because I think, and I would include myself in this category, certainly know the name Audre Lorde. I think anecdotally, one of the more quoted poets that I've seen in contemporary times today, especially within activist circles. You go to a rally for Palestine, you're likely to see a quote by Audre Lorde. If you have friends on social media, you certainly have seen quotes by Audre Lorde. Quotes like this: "Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it's self-preservation. And that is an act of political warfare." That's a quote I have seen quite often. But I do think there's probably many people who may be familiar with the name Audre Lorde, may know a quote or two, but may not fully know the life and who Audre Lorde was. You've spent years with Audre Lorde and Audre Lorde's writings. And when I say years, I don't mean to suggest physical. You're with her physically, but I know you've dived deeply into her work and into her papers. So when you give talks about Audre Lorde, what do you tell people that is important to know about who Audre Lorde was?
Wow. Well, I mean, everything about Audre Lorde is important to me, right? And as you shared from her speech when she was accepting her poet laureateship for New York State, she would use this litany of who she was, right? Black, lesbian, feminist, socialist, warrior, poet, mother. And she really understood that there was a multiplicity to who all of us are, right? But I think that something that's really important to me about Audre Lorde and the way that I framed this particular biography is that she saw herself not only as a warrior, but also as a survivor. And she thought about what it meant to survive what she called the atomic age. You know, she, like some of the other writers who she worked with and who I admire, like June Jordan and Toni Cade Bambara, they grew up just blocks away from where the Manhattan Project was taking place at Columbia University, where the atomic bomb was invented. And they grew up in the midst of the world wars, and they were survivors of that age. They were the kids who were taught to get under your desk because you might be bombed at any moment, right? And so that was a huge part of her consciousness. And as a student, she was involved in the Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy. She was really concerned about weapons. Even in the speech that you quoted, she goes on in that speech to talk about contradictions. And what she talks about at length is United States military weapons spending and how the entire budget for the arts in the United States is less than one tank that the U.S. military spends money on. And obviously, the spending is huge. And she also made those connections to what that meant in terms of imperialism, in terms of what that meant in terms of the United States impact around the world. So I want people to know that Audre Lorde was a poet, a survivor, a person who felt in deep relationship with the planet and really used her poetry as a process to activate all of us to be intentional about our survival, our collective survival as this planet.
Audre Lorde's relationship to the planet is important, and it's an important element of the book that you have written about Audre Lorde. We think of Audre Lorde as the activist, which Audre Lorde was, but a part of that was her relationship to nature, to ecology, sort of a self-taught scientist. Mm-hmm. Is that correct?
That is correct. I mean, she was a profoundly curious person, and she just read on all the topics that were interesting to her. She also, her partner of 17 years was a scientist, and she had no issue, delving into research journals, really reading cutting edge research in any topic that she was interested in, from astronomy to geology to eventually cancer treatments and medical research. And I really wanted to honor that in the way that I wrote this biography, which meant that my research was not only, I have had the opportunity to spend years with her archival papers and interview people who knew her, and of course, read and reread her texts and her published texts and her interviews. But I also needed to do research on this planet to really understand her and her viewpoint and her philosophies. So that was a huge part of it. And there's something really important about that. And it's not only Audre Lorde. I think that when we think about environmental activism, there's somehow the fact that, Black feminists were involved in environmental activism. They were involved in anti-nuclear protests. They were involved in protesting against toxic waste dumping and pollution. And they wrote about this in their work. They spoke about it in their interviews, but somehow we reach this moment where we, in fact, need that insight and environmental activism and that legacy, possibly more than we ever have, facing the climate crisis that we're facing. And that part of their legacy is not centered as much as it could be. So that's something that I really wanted to emphasize and remind us of, because Black feminist activism has never been separate from environmental activism. Black feminist activism has been concerned with this question of how do we create a life-giving context? How do we actually create home? How do we live here? And that is an environmental question, right? That's a question that has everything to do with how we relate to the planet. Audre Lorde would often say, it matters how we relate to each other. But if we're not in relationship with this planet, we don't have anywhere to even have these relationships with each other that are, informed by the ethics of justice and liberation that we're creating together.
Again, I think many of us think of Audre Lorde, the activist, which is the right thing to do. But Audre Lorde was also a polymath and an autodidact, mm-hmm. right? She just had large curiosity that she pursued in many different fields and subjects.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And I think that, it's really important that we don't reduce our ancestors or even our elders to any narrow part of themselves. Not to say activist is narrow. Obviously, that's expansive. Poet is expansive. But I think that our ancestors and our elders have so much to teach us. Anyone who sits with an elder, my grandmother is about to turn 90 years old. There's so much there. And I think that we have to be as curious as they are, right? In order to really honor them. And what you might notice is that when there's only one thing about a particular elder or ancestor that gets repeated, sometimes it can be the aspect of them that is least challenging to us as movements, or most useful to capitalism, right, in its perpetuation. And so we always, especially if we are, scholars of these people, or if we're taking the responsibility of something like a biography to bring their legacy to another generation, we really have to be expansive in the way that we remember that everyone is so much, right? And I felt really honored to give Audre Lorde a lot of space and to give us a lot of points of encounter with her.
Audre Lorde was born in 1934 in New York City. Her parents were immigrants from the Caribbean. So she's born in the midst of the Great Depression. As you said earlier, she grew up just blocks away from where the Manhattan Project was happening, development of an atomic weapon. What's important, do you think, to know about Audre Lorde's younger years and her relationship with her parents and what it meant to be a child from immigrants from the Caribbean?
Yeah, it was a very volatile time, right? So Audre Lorde's parents migrated from Grenada. Her father had migrated to Grenada from Barbados. They, like a lot of other Caribbean immigrants, arrive in Harlem. At the same time, the Great Migration is happening. Former agricultural workers from the U.S. South are migrating to New York and also to other urban centers. Rural people in general are migrating to the cities, after World War I and leading up to World War II. And there were also wars happening all the time, right? There were wars happening in Europe that the United States was involved in. There were riots happening in Harlem in protest of the racism that Black communities were experiencing there. And so this is the context
she
that
grew up in Harlem.
Was born in.
Did she grow up in Harlem specifically?
Yes, she did. She grew up in Harlem. She was born and raised in Harlem. And her family also was volatile in certain ways. But what they were trying to do was to create the safety that they could create in the midst of all of this. As you mentioned, the Great Depression, the world wars, the riots of Harlem, the police brutality, all of the things that a Black family living in Harlem would face. They wanted their 3 daughters to survive. And so they were really strict with them. And they also poured into them. They brought them to the library. They brought books home to them. They made sure they could take tests to go to schools where they would be challenged. And at the same time, Audre Lorde felt that that strictness and rigidness and really a lot of fear that she grew up living inside of was constraining and constricting to her and was emotionally repressive. And so she had this mission to honor her emotions, and her poetry became the way that she really gave space to what her emotional reality was teaching us. And she wanted to create this context where the oppressive conditions around us don't shut us down emotionally and disempower us. We actually are responsible for transubstantiating our emotional responses to oppression into clarity and insight and sharing it with each other and remembering how powerful we are. So she was a rebel in a very strict family. And that was, not easy for anyone involved.
This began in the home.
Yeah. Her first activism absolutely was the standing up for herself and the speaking out that she did in her home. Now, she also had delayed speech, or what they call delayed speech. She didn't actually begin speaking until she was 4 or 5 years old. So what speaking out meant, according to her older sisters, was that she would have these extreme tantrums when she was, a toddler and a young child. And she ultimately found a way to channel that protest into, what we have received, some of the most powerful, enduring, moving, electrifying poetry that anyone has ever written.
That's interesting. I was going to ask you about her delayed speech, because I was wondering if that was apocryphal or not, because the story I heard about the delayed speech was that she really didn't speak until she was 4 or 5, which is, and I wonder if it was apocryphal because it's such a story, right? This great voice didn't speak for the first 4 or 5 years of her life. And so I was wondering, is this apocryphal or not? Because I also heard that she didn't really start speaking until she learned how to write.
Yeah, I mean, so all we have is, what she says, right? What I can say is that that's a consistent claim that she makes.
So that's her story, though. Yeah, it came from her.
That's her story, and she definitely stuck to it. So I could say that. I can't go back in time and see, like, did she really say a word when she was 3? Maybe, I don't know. But the way that she tells the story is that she did not, and that it wasn't until, she was in library club. She had learned to read. She, she talks about her librarian at the Harlem branch of New York Public Library, which is now Schomburg Center. She talks about that being a life-changing revelation to really meet this librarian who was also a storyteller and understand what stories could potentially be for her and what words could potentially do. And she started memorizing poems and speaking those words. And that was her access point to language.
Again, she was born and grew up in Harlem. Harlem, especially in the first half of the 20th century, is such a hub for American Black culture and has an extremely robust and strong literary movement. Many great writers came from Harlem in the first half of the 20th century. Was that an influence on her?
For sure it was. I mean, her just being at the library, right? Because Langston Hughes used to be at that library. It's just like, being Langston Hughes. And Audre Lorde, as a teenager, she became involved in the Harlem Writers Guild that John Henrik Clarke had created. Another Langston Hughes was also involved there. She absolutely benefited from that literary movement and the institutions of that literary movement. And I think this is part of what let her know that she could be a poet and that there were Black poets that she could be in community with and mentored by. Now, she also there was not honesty and openness about sexuality in those institutions, so she also felt similarly to how she felt in her family, right? She felt limited, constricted in certain ways that she then would rebel against. But one of the first places that published her poetry was the Harlem Writers Guild, for example, and that meant a lot to her.
Yeah, I want to ask about her identity as a lesbian and ask about what was that dynamic like, especially in her early life. When did she start, identifying outwardly as being a lesbian? And this is a time in which it's very difficult to be homosexual, outwardly homosexual. What and I was going to ask, what was that part of the friction between her and her family?
Yeah, I think so. I think it was. I mean, I think that, her parents, from what I can see, her parents had a lot of strategies for safety, right? And their daughter being an out lesbian was not necessarily in alignment with safety in a time where that was so dangerous, because of the legalized homophobia and the violence that out lesbian and gay folks and trans folks were experiencing all the time, and in some cases literally dying because of. So she knew, though, early on, and you can see in her teenage journals, I mean, she has an elaborate love proposal to her high school English teacher, for example, which is a whole story, but I think also an important part of her process of claiming her own identity. And she, so she's part of this group the branded, right? She's part of this group of kind of like outcast girls, but she's the only Black girl in that group. And I do, though, think that being part of a self-identified group of misfits and outcasts also helped her to just continue to be honest with herself about who she was. And she had to strategically navigate. I mean, we have to remember this is a time when Audre Lorde was a college student. She was suspended for wearing pants, let alone being a lesbian,
Yeah.
which, yeah. So this is the 1950s when she's in college, and, the McCarthyism, the deep fear of homosexuality because of also the Kinsey's report's acknowledgement that there actually is so much homosexuality everywhere in the United States. It was real complicated mathematics for her to be herself and have her relationships. And at the same time, of course, she's part of this bohemian, creative, expansively thinking community of people who are the people that she decides to be friends with and the people that she's drawn to, including, Ed Rollins, who will become her husband, who are way more open-minded about what sexuality is and what people can do and how people can be related to each other and love each other.
Wasn't he gay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And this was common in the 1950s. Gay men and lesbian women would marry so to be able to pass in society.
Because this is what we have. Compulsory heterosexuality, right, is what they were living through, and they had to find a way to live their lives. But they also really did care about each other, and they really did want to have children together, and they did. They did support each other in important ways, but they were doing that amidst very limited options in a, intolerant is saying the least of it, what they were living through. So it isn't until really in the 60s when Audre Lorde starts to be more out. She's one of the broadside poets into the 70s, and that's also another space of nationalism where this idea of compulsory heterosexuality is showing up in its own way. It's not different than the general compulsory homosexuality of the United States at that time, but it's its own version of it. And so she does come out in that context, and that was a very brave and scary and costly act of integrity that she took at that time. And she also was working as one of the founders of Black Studies in the City University of New York system. And, she talks about receiving death threats. She talks about the bullying and the intimidation by people who maybe they knew, they were like, we know, but you're not supposed to say it. And the dignity that she insisted on to say, you know what, I'm going to say my truth, and I'm no longer going to pass for a straight person because it makes other people more comfortable or because it puts forward an agenda that will never include all of me. And, there were costs for that. There were other folks who were honest about their sexuality way later than she was, or who never were, and just continue to have that be their privacy, who had literary opportunities that she never got. There are ways that, I'm so grateful that her voice has endured and that her community made sure that her words were there for someone like me, a younger person who never got to meet her. But some of the things that she may have wanted to do, like write in the New York Times, which she read and critiqued every single day, were not open to her, or any Black lesbian, right, during that time. So I think that when I think about her as a survivor, I think about what it means to live and work with your integrity intact. I think about what it means to be honest about yourself in a way that makes space for people coming behind you in the future. she really grieved the fact that she didn't have Black lesbian role models to think about. Even though, like, Angelina Weld Grimke, for example, was a Black woman poet who loved women, who in fact grew up also in Harlem. But because those stories were erased, Audre Lorde had to feel alone in a way that she didn't want future people, or really even her contemporaries, to feel alone.
Would Audre Lorde find her story later? Find out about her later?
She did. Yeah, she did find out about that later. She wrote about it in her journal, like what it would have meant to her to know that. I mean, yeah. And so she was very intentional about, thus the litany of saying, I am a Black lesbian, feminist, warrior, poet, mother, because she didn't want to withhold the truth of her being from her community, even people she hadn't met yet, who would need that.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation about the lifetimes and influences of Audre Lorde. Our guest for this conversation is Alexis Pauline Gumbs, award-winning author of many books, including her latest, which is a biography on Audre Lorde called Survival is a Promise: The Eternal Life of Audre Lorde. Let's stick with the 1970s. Regrettably, we have limited amount of time. It is possible to go through the whole biography, but the 1970s is important. She's a professor, a professor of English, I believe, at CUNY College in New York City, and she's very much part of a struggle for the creation, I guess, of Black studies, ethnic studies. You will tell me specifically which the proper terminology there. And this is also a time when she forms a close relationship with another important poet, June Jordan. Can you tell me about who June Jordan was and the relationship that Audre Lorde and June Jordan had?
Absolutely, yeah. Audre Lorde and June Jordan were close in age. They both were born in Harlem. June Jordan's family ends up moving to Brooklyn, but June Jordan was born in 1936, so they're only 2 years apart.
Did they know each other before? Did they grow up with each other?
No, that I know of, they didn't grow up together. They met each other because of June Jordan's family moving to Brooklyn. They were never in the same, schools growing up, but they remember meeting each other in struggle. They were supporting the student protesters in 1969 who took over City College. Yes, in the name of what we now call ethnic studies. They were saying Black and Puerto Rican studies at that time. And they were doing this very much in solidarity with Black liberation movements and the Puerto Rican liberation movement. And so this is how they met each other, because they worked in a program called the SEEK program, which was an opportunity program for students who had been underserved in their high schools to support them as they matriculated into the city university. And these are the students who are also the leaders of these protests. So they supported their students, they risked their jobs, and they found each other in that. Now, they also eventually were in similar social circles. They also were at salons, like Alexis DeVoe and Gwendolyn Hardwick would have these wonderful salons in Brooklyn that were places where women who loved women would be able to share their art, but also have social interactions with other women who loved women. It was a lot later that June Jordan was able to talk about her sexuality in a way that aligned with her integrity. But yeah, they were colleagues, they were friends, they had a beautiful correspondence, they shared about their love lives, they shared about their health challenges. They supported each other and invited each other to share poetry and to speak at different events. And they would call each other sister. They had an important sisterhood in that time in the 70s. Yeah.
What put Audre Lorde on the map? Is there a single event, a single essay, a single book, a single poem that sort of propelled her to being well known?
That's a great question. I mean, so So one thing that was very important is that Gwendolyn Brooks loved Audre Lorde's poetry, and she was the person who told Dudley Randall, founder of Broadside Press, this poet should be one of the Broadside poets. Broadside poets was a big deal, right? So you have Nikki Giovanni, Sonia Sanchez, Audre Lorde, right? These are examples of who the Broadside poets are, and we remember those names, right? Because Broadside was committed to accessibility and that the great poetry of Black folks would be available to the movements that Black people were participating in, right? So a lot of people first learned about Audre Lorde because she was a Broadside poet.
Is this a movement? Would you characterize this as a literary movement?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. A very important part of the literary aspect of the Black arts movement was the work of Broadside Press. And so this was huge in terms of Audre Lorde's visibility. And then ultimately, she was published by Norton, which, you know, is a very prestigious mainstream press. Certainly their poetry list is acknowledged in the mainstream as one of the best. And so that was really important to her, that when she published her collection Coal with Norton, she felt like she really was an established, respected poet. And so those may be things, I mean, it's like what put her on the map? I guess, therefore, she was on the map, right? And so at that point, she's being now taught, right, by other people in their classes. And she's doing stuff like this. She's doing radio interviews, you know, that I went back and listened to. And she's touring around the country when she has new books of poetry and meeting a lot of different people. And in the lesbian feminist movement, the poets were like rock stars, you know, Audre Lorde, Adrienne Rich, Pat Parker, like these people, because it was like they were saying something that so many people felt, but they had never been allowed to say. It was like huge. The way that people were grateful, people were excited, people were interested in these poets as leaders, you know, leaders of voice. And of course, all of the poets I mentioned, they were also activists, right? And they were also very much involved with grassroots movements everywhere that they were. So I think that this is part of what allowed Audre Lorde to reach the hearts of so many people, those people who really do testify that reading her words freed them. It changed their lives. It allowed them to be more honest with themselves. It allowed them to make big changes in their lives. It motivated their activism. And so these are the people who then would become the advocates when, unfortunately, Audre Lorde died at an early age, only 58 years old. These are the people who would say, oh, but, and she said, my words will be there, right? She made a commitment. She wanted her words to go into the future. But we know that only happens if the living take accountability for that. And so these are the people who said, oh no, we want there to be a collected poems of Audre Lorde. We want there to be books and films about Audre Lorde. We are going to quote Audre Lorde. And her students are a huge part of that. And her loved ones and her family are a very big part of that. And then many people who never met her, whose lives were changed by her writing, also took that on.
So, sounds to me this is an important literary movement that needs to be remembered that way. And am I correct? It seems like this is a literary movement of many lesbians in the 1970s.
Yeah, lesbian feminist poetry movement. Yeah. Absolutely. And, you know, there are presses like Firebrand Press that come out of this. There's Persephone Press before that. There's Kitchen Table Women of Color Press, which is founded by lesbians of color. Barbara Smith, who is the main central person who kept Kitchen Table Press together, talks about a conversation between her and Audre Lorde that was really the founding moment. So yes, it is a crucial literary movement. And I mean, myself as a writer coming decades after that, I don't know who I would even be without that movement. I especially thank Barbara Smith and Kitchen Table Press because they are the ones who made sure that particular anthologies like Homegirls and like Cuentos would stay in print so they could be taught in the classrooms I would end up in and my whole generation that we would end up in. And they've influenced us, I mean, formatively.
I just want to acknowledge that I know I have listeners who are like, come on, Mitch, you should be able to name all this off your top of your head, and then they would be right. But here we are, and this is fascinating to me and important to know about. We have done shows we did one show on Adrienne Rich, but it sounds like we need to do more.
Yeah, there's always more.
It sounds like there is a lot more. Audre Lorde kept a relationship with the Caribbean. Again, her parents are from the Caribbean. She would live in St. Croix, the Virgin Islands. This is an important story, her relationship to St. Croix and the Virgin Islands, especially in the aftermath. Never really thought of it this way, of Hurricane Hugo. And there was it was very mindful to me. There was a precursor to what happened to New Orleans and with Hurricane Katrina. It happened, 15 years or roughly 15 years or so before in St. Croix. Tell me about her relationship to the Virgin Islands.
So Audre Lorde, yes, she always had an important relationship to the Caribbean. She said she was raised to think of the Caribbean as like their true home, even though her family had immigrated to New York. And I mean, even a precursor to her moving to St. Croix is her solidarity with the revolution in Grenada. And she was a supporter of the Grenadian Revolution, first Black English-speaking country in the Western Hemisphere to have a socialist revolution. And she was also devastated by the U.S. invasion of and suppression of that revolution. And so she went to Grenada. And that was really something that influenced her understanding of what her responsibility was as a person of the Caribbean. Now, there's also the fact that she was surviving cancer. And so medically, she was realizing that she took a profound immune-centered approach to living with cancer. And she lengthened her life, and she had such an incredible quality of life as somebody who was living with cancer, because once again, she did that scientific research, she read those cutting edge studies, and she understood that there were alternatives to surgery and to radiation and chemotherapy that she could access for as long as she could. And so actually being in a warm climate was very supportive it's supportive to anyone's immune system, I think, but especially someone from the Caribbean, right? So she also was thinking holistically. You know, she was thinking about the stress that she experienced living in New York City. And she decided with her partner at the time, Gloria Joseph, that actually living in St. Croix was the best thing for her health, but it was also very aligned with her political solidarity. She was involved in movements in St. Croix to have a new constitution. She was very much involved in the activism happening there. And she was really happy to be in a majority Black space. She talked about the Blackfulness of St. Croix as something that was healing for her. So then when Hurricane Hugo comes in 1989 and devastates, 90% of the homes in St. Croix are destroyed in one night by Hurricane Hugo. And instead of the compassionate humanitarian aid that you would, of course, want to happen when a group of people survive a major disaster, instead, it's a militarized occupation. Instead, like happened later in Katrina, the people are mischaracterized as looters. They have curfews imposed upon them. They are, in some cases, like also happened in Katrina, separated from each other and abandoned, right, by the United States government in particular, who should be supporting them, right? Because they've taken on St. Croix as a colony. So this is something that Audre Lorde writes about, and she's very strategic because she knows at this point she's a world-renowned writer. And the narrative that the world is receiving about the survivors of Hugo and St. Croix is that they're just like dangerous looters, when really they're a beautiful, resilient community that's trying to survive a horrific storm. And so she's like, of course I have to write about this. And she and Gloria Joseph create an independent press to publish a whole book called Hugo, which has real people's survival accounts of how they survived Hugo and what they experienced. She herself writes an open letter called Hugo Letter of Generators and Survivals, which is distributed. I mean, it's published in Callaloo, distributed in Black literary circles, but it's also distributed by Ashe, a Black lesbian feminist organization in the Bay Area, which also is collecting supplies and sending mutual aid to support the community surviving in St. Croix. And then, of course, there's an earthquake in Santa Cruz, like where they're based. And Audre Lorde is thinking about these natural disasters in an ecological frame. And, she understands that they are related to the climate changes that industrialization has imposed. So this is another reason why she's such an important thinker for us to be thinking with right now, as, we've just had the earliest ever Category 4 hurricane to ever happen in, recorded meteorology, right? We'll say, which is Hurricane Beryl, which devastated Carriacou, which is an ancestral home of Audre Lorde. Audre Lorde's mothers were from Carriacou, and that is a community that is right now surviving, along with St. Vincent, along with especially other spaces in Grenada, and the Grenadines are surviving that. And it's very clear that the overheating of the ocean, which is caused by major carbon emissions by the first world, what we'll call the first world, the global north, the people in the Caribbean, as part of the global south, are paying the price for that heat, propelling the wind of the storm at rates that you would never see. I mean, the last day of May, the first day of June, that has not been a time where there could be such a powerful storm until now.
Yeah. Anywhere you go on this planet, you talk to anyone about how the weather has changed, and everyone will tell you how it has changed.
Yeah.
She was a fierce critic of U.S. influence and military influence.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, Audre Lorde would say often that the United States was on the wrong side of every liberation struggle on the planet. And she said that as part of her solidarity with Palestine. She said that for sure as part of her solidarity with Grenada.
So she was paying attention. I mean, again, her sort of years are 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, early 90s before she dies at 58. At this period of time, she's paying attention to Palestine.
Yes, she's definitely paying attention to Palestine, South Africa. Yeah. She's also paying attention to what's going on in Germany with neo-fascism. The thing is, she's in relationship, right, with writers from South Africa and writers from Germany and writers from Australia and writers in the Caribbean. And she's seeing what the United States is doing. And she understands that she has a responsibility, because she's also, coming back to the fact that she's reading and critiquing the New York Times every day, she's also understanding that the narrative about U.S. foreign policy that appears there is erasing so much, and is what she felt was manipulating the U.S. taxpayers into funding horrors all over the world. So she would write about this in her poetry, and she would listen to the women who were surviving these atrocities, and she would write about it so that other people in the United States could understand and could have an informed solidarity with oppressed people around the world.
Audre Lorde died in 1992 of cancer. Tell me about her. Tell me about her battle with cancer and her death.
Yeah, so Audre Lorde lived with cancer for over a decade. And something that's so important to me is that she understood surviving cancer as something as political as everything else. She understood her identity as a person with cancer as also a political identity. And she knew it was a political identity because people tried to get her to hide it. You know, people tried, after she had a mastectomy from breast cancer, people tried to get her to wear a prosthesis to be able to pretend like nothing had happened. And she's like, well, once people are trying to get you to hide, what does that do? It disconnects us from each other, right? It disempowers us. She wanted other cancer survivors to be able to move together and to be powerful. And she had a critique of what she understood to be the cancer industry and how it disempowered patients and how there's more money for treating breast cancer than from preventing breast cancer at the time, and all of this. So her battle with cancer was very deeply personal, obviously physical. She had to understand what her own body needed. And she had incredible results with, she used a mistletoe infusion. She used a extremely holistic immunotherapy approach. She changed what she ate. As I mentioned, she changed where she lived. She changed her mind state out of the stress of New York City or even the stress of working in the university to a whole nother life. And she shrunk tumors. She, gained weight. She was eating fresh fruit and swimming in the ocean and being part of a beekeeping collective and being in love. And this was a beautiful thing. And ultimately, after many years, she did, her cancer metastasized to her liver. She did have to engage in some really harsh treatments. She did engage in radiation therapy at the very, very end of her life. And she even was theorizing that, she was writing about the great mystery that she was going into and her great curiosity about what her legacy would be. And she has this journal entry. It's one of her journal entries that she published in the cancer journals. And she is basically getting this terrible news. Oh, actually, no, it's in a burst of light about her cancer returning. And she's like, I'm going to go out like an effing meteor, right? She renews her commitment. She says, I'm going to write and speak fire out of every orifice of my body, right? She's like, out of my eye holes, my nose holes. She's just like writing this in her journal, like to say she's taking this new terrible information about cancer, not as a reason to shut down, but as a reason to live even more passionately. And she does this, and she does this for years. And then in 1992, in November, she actually did take her last breath in the midst of a meteor shower. And she was surrounded by loved ones who were with her in St. Croix.
And she was witnessing this meteor shower?
It was just happening. So I don't know if where she was in a hospital bed that had been moved into her writing studio. I've been in that writing studio and it does have really big windows, but I don't have evidence that she was like, look, a meteor. So
time to go.
Right. But that is in fact what was happening. So I often wonder, like, how can you know that? And maybe she didn't know, but maybe there's still a poetic reality to the fact that there was a truth she was tapping into when she said, I'm going to go out like a meteor. That wasn't necessarily literal, but the literal reality did line up with it. So yeah, those were the circumstances. And she had left instructions for Gloria Joseph and for her children to put her ashes many different places around the planet. And they did that. And many, many, many memorial services showed up because people really felt the importance of and wanted to express their gratitude for the great example of her life and the great contribution of her words. And yeah, I think that the way that she lived and even the way that she died is a huge model for any of us who, of course, as we all are, face our own mortality.
Amazing. Alexis Pauline Gumbs has joined us for a conversation about Audre Lorde. She is the author of the biography called Survival is a Promise, The Eternal Life of Audre Lorde. Alexis Pauline Gumbs, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you deeply for taking this time to talk about Audre Lorde.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I just love talking about Audre Lorde, so thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for the beautiful work that you do bringing our literary and activist movements together. I really appreciate it.